There we go. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you all. I'm Kate Gordon, and I'm actually sharing the stage with Sal, who did the real work on this project. So I'm only going to talk for a few minutes about the overarching strategy of how we brought the project together and what we were trying to accomplish with it. But Risky Business really is a three equal part strategy of really solid underlying research, which is provided by the American Climate Prospectus, which is a team brought together by the Rhodium group. Saul will be talking about that. But it also had a huge communication strategy and a very, very kind of an intentional strategy of the people we put out in front as well. So this should not be seen just as a research or just as a communications project. It really was both. And I think that's what made it, or is making it, as effective as it has been. So we decided to do the Risky Business Report, which was released, the initial report released in June of last year, really to try to shift the U.S. conversation about climate change toward a discussion about business practices, mainstream business practices in the economy, to get it out of the partisan holes that it has generally been falling into, either the fight over the science, whether it's real, or the fight over the specific policy solution that we should pursue. So in order to move the issue of climate change out of that space and try to get it into mainstream business language and the language of risk, we decided to put together, after a lot of thought and a lot of study of other ways that people have done this, for instance, the Stern Review in 2006, we decided at my organization, Next Generation, to essentially put together a business-focused, outside of Washington, outside of the mainstream environmental community, project with nonpartisan, business-focused, across-the-board leadership with unassailable underlying data and a strong communications platform to essentially inject the idea of climate risk into the mainstream business community. Again, what we did was a very deliberately nonpartisan approach. The risk committee we put together, which is what we called it, was co-chaired by Hank Paulson, of course, the former Secretary of Treasury under George Bush. Mike Bloomberg, of course, we all know who he is. I think the New York Times described him as mayor of Earth the other day, which I think is pretty accurate. And Tom Steyer, who, when we started this project, was known for being the founder and partner of Farallon Capital, and his profile changed quite a lot over the course of the project. But the three of them really spearheaded this project, funded it, and brought together a much larger group of leaders who have become real leaders on the issue of climate risk. We did this as an independent risk assessment that the Risk Committee commissioned. We worked very closely with Rhodium Group, and Saul was part of the Rhodium Group research team that Trevor Hauser at Rhodium Group put together. RMS also, which is the largest global risk assessor for the insurance and reinsurance companies, did most of the underlying work on sea level rise and coastal impacts for this project. We were incredibly fortunate to be able to work with RMS. That was not part of our original plan, but they came to us and offered their services, which was really fantastic. And finally, we decided we had to do this project as you would do a classic risk assessment in the business community, which is, and Saul will talk more about how we did that on the research side, but on the political side, that means you don't tell people what the answer is. In a classic risk assessment, you say, here are the risks, here are the ranges, here are the tail risks, and you leave it to individual sectors and individual actors and responders to respond. We actually found that that was the single most important thing about this project from a political standpoint. It's the piece that's allowed us to use the project to open doors to conversations with traditionally very conservative audiences like the agribusiness audience, and was incredibly important to the project. The risk committee here included, I'll go through all these folks if you don't recognize them right away. There's Mike Bloomberg, of course, Hank Paulson, going from the top left, Hank Paulson, Tom Steyer, Henry Cisneros, former HUD secretary and former mayor of San Antonio, now a real estate developer of quite some note. Greg Page, who was the CEO of Cargill for 10 years and is now the executive chair of their board. Bob Rubin, of course, on the bottom there. Donna Shalala, who was obviously the head of HHS under Clinton, but now is the president of the University of Miami. George Schultz, former cabinet secretary of everything that you can think of, 5 cabinet positions in his life. Olympia Snow, of course, and then Al Summer at the end, who is the former dean of public health at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. So it's a cross-section of Republicans and Democrats, people from different sectors of the economy, particularly agriculture and health and coastal property, and also a cross-section of people from different regions of the country. We also designed this so that we would have an independent expert review committee oversee the research that was separate from the overarching risk committee. And you recognize a lot of these folks, I'm sure. This committee itself was brought together because of a variety of views, a variety of perspectives, and a fairly nonpartisan approach. So I'll just say a couple more things about it. We released the project in June with two major goals. We had three goals. One of them is very academic, which was to create a body of research that could be used by everybody to advance the climate risk debate. The entire body of research is open source, and we're working to get it online now, so I'll just make that clear. But the other two public-facing goals were to create a new set of messengers to really be high-level, high-profile messengers on climate risk, and to change the conversation from an environmental to a business conversation. We have really achieved that. The Columbia Business Journalism Review came out with an assessment of the changing media coverage of climate and pointed to this report as one of the major pieces that had changed the debate. We also got over 500 media hits, many of them in above-the-fold editorials in the Financial Times, Forbes, The Economist, a very, very good cross-section of business media as well as industry media. My personal favorite, Hog Farmer Daily, covered this report in detail. So I'm really excited by what we were able to achieve. We only could have done it. We took the regional definitions and the climate science from the National Climate Assessment and worked closely with their staff, even though we were released around the same time, a little after them. But we also brought in a huge amount of other research and academic, interdisciplinary academic work, which I'm going to turn to Saul to talk more about because it was really the meat of the project.
Thanks a lot. So I'm going to try to just motivate you to go look at this report online because there's no way I can possibly convey everything that we've done. There's it was a large collaboration between researchers at Berkeley, the Rhodium Group, Rutgers, Columbia University, RMS, and many places. And so just to give you a sense, we developed a system we call the Seaglass Model, and the idea is to build up a spatial and probabilistic understanding that's based on solid empirical relationships that are then integrated into a large-scale economic analysis. And one important point of the report is that we held a very high standard on what constituted evidence and what we were applying to thinking about the national economy. And so there are many things that are omitted from the report because we don't yet know how to value these things in an economic sense. That doesn't mean that they're not important, and it doesn't mean that we don't think they're important or that they should someday be included. It just means that we don't yet know how to think about what the economic impact is for those specific mechanisms. Okay. Now, one part of the report was to take sort of these RCP projections of various climate scenarios that you are all very familiar with, construct probability distributions for what global warming at a global scale will be, and then to take those probability distributions and map them onto 44 different downscaled climate models, where here's an example of sort of on the left you have median projections for summertime temperature, and on the right you have the 1 in 20 outcome for different counties. And just these types of visuals were very effective in communicating with many folks how the distribution of temperatures will change in the future. On the right you see a graph, for example, where each state's summertime temperature, average summertime temperature across a very large ensemble of models is plotted in the pre-industrial period and in the future, and you can sort of just see that, for example, New Jersey will be about as hot in the summer as Texas is today. On top of this sort of finally resolved distribution of temperatures, we were taking into account sort of different types of standard natural variability, including sort of seasonal cycles as well as daily weather. And we also linked it to a variety of other types of data sources. And so, for example, we developed the first projections of humidity across the country. And so one of the important findings was that the actual number of dangerously hot and humid days throughout the eastern United States is going to go up dramatically in future periods. We also, for a variety of other factors, tried to create localized projections. So here's an example of sea level rise projections that incorporate both global scale patterns as well as regional level dynamics. For example, subsidence along the Gulf Coast or the effect of melting glaciers in the Pacific Northwest. And then all of these various climate projections were linked to a large number of economic relationships that have been uncovered recently by the econometric community that I'm a member of. And the first step of this was to actually develop something we call the distributed meta-analysis system, where you basically have researchers that can upload empirical relationships, and then those relationships are combined using a Bayesian framework to define an optimal composite estimate for the relationship between the climate and some aspect of the economy. Now, what's useful about a Bayesian approach is that in the future we will learn more about our relationship to the climate, and those results can be input into this system so that in the future, in sort of the iterative reporting approach that was described earlier, future assessments can be updated to sort of represent what we've learned about the system. Now, what I'm showing you here is just an example relationship between one dimension of the economy and two dimensions of the climate that we think are important. So these are results that we've pulled from the literature on the effect of daily temperature on the left and seasonal precipitation on the right on sort of localized maize yields. And so one thing you see, for example, is that as daily temperatures rise, maize yields increase very slightly, and then as soon as they pass 29 degrees Celsius, there's a steep decline. And so this sort of understanding the exact number of days that exceed that temperature was a really important aspect of the downscaling approach, because we really had to precisely understand what's going on locally at the hourly level to sort of have any sense of what will happen to maize yields. And so when we link these types of econometric results to those projections, and then we resample from a very large number of climate models and realizations of future natural variability, we're able to construct national probabilistic projections. So what I've shown you here on the top are three probability distributions. Time is going vertically. And so by end of century, in the median scenario, we estimate that sort of nationally representative yields will decline by about 15%, according to a variety of estimates that have all been integrated using this approach. And you can see also that as time moves forward, the variance is increasing substantially. Okay? And that is an important aspect of the risk assessment, is that there is, for example, a reasonable 15% probability that conditions will be below, for example, yields of 40%. And just for a sense of scale, that's saying things are going to be, there's a 15% chance you might be in something that looks worse than a perpetual dust bowl. Okay? And there's a variety of sensitivity tests in the report. So for example, in the lower panel, we show what happens when you remove CO2 fertilization, which is a relatively poorly estimated parameter empirically. So we do this for a variety of different sectors. We have yields, like I was showing you, and we have fairly high spatial resolution, although each county actually has its own probability distribution of economic outcomes across each scenario, as well as things like mortality on the lower left. We looked at several new sectors that hadn't previously been accounted for in any economic analysis of climate change. So in the upper right, for example, you see changes in labor productivity, and in the lower right, you see changes in violent crime rates. Okay? Now, one thing that's conspicuous is on the right-hand side, those maps look sort of uniformly red, whereas on the left, you see large green and red regions. And that was an important finding in this report. Certain dimensions of climate change will generate both winners and losers. There are regions where yields will go up, or where longevity will increase, and other regions that will suffer from higher rates of mortality or declines in yields. And so this allows us to sort of understand how climate change will lead to basically a redistribution of economic well-being across the country, something that we discuss in sort of great detail and hasn't been previously considered. The effects on the right tend to be relatively uniformly red because there's not much variation across the country in terms of how those economic burdens will be felt. There's other analysis in the report. For example, we examined the frequency with which extreme events will reoccur. So here's an example from the mortality numbers. What we see is that on the y-axis is the number of times an extreme event will occur, an event that we would expect to see once every 20 years historically. And so in the highest RCP 8.5 scenario, we see that by end of century, extreme mortality events become quite frequent, whereas if we can pull back from RCP 8.5, we can dramatically reduce the number of these extreme mortality events we expect to experience going forward. Now these results are, and then there's also two sectors where we didn't have sufficiently strong econometric estimates to rely on them alone, but we had detailed sectoral models. So we worked with RMS to build up a tropical cyclone model of the Atlantic that was driven by climate forcing, and then we modeled at a very fine resolution impacts along the eastern seaboard, and we were able to pin down estimates at a highly disaggregated level under both scenarios where we allow hurricanes to become amplified according to a certain projection, as well as cases where we just hold hurricane activity fixed and think about what is the relative effect of just allowing sea level to rise. In other cases, in another sectoral model, we examined energy demand across the United States, calibrating it to empirical estimates that have been observed historically. And so what you see on the right, for example, are the amplification of energy demand as basically demand for cooling goes up because of the large number of hot days. Now, all of these results are then integrated in a larger integrated assessment across the country, and one of the really useful exercises here was being able to quantify these economic impacts in sort of a common framework and then hold them up next to each other to understand what are the large economic impacts in a quantitative sense. So one of the largest impact by far is sort of the economic burden of excess mortality among the sectors that we were evaluating. And then the second largest sector you see is labor productivity, that's the yellow bar. And coming in quite close are sort of coastal damages due to both inundation and hurricanes, as well as increased costs due to energy demand. And then following that are things like agriculture and the economic impacts of amplified crime rates. Okay? And so thinking about sort of the distribution of uncertainty for all these impacts and their overall magnitude, we think is quite useful for thinking both about how to allocate things like adaptation spending, as well as additional research effort in the future. So, for example, labor productivity is one of the most understudied impacts, and yet it seems to have a very large economic impact when we sit down and crunch the numbers. This is broken down. Now, what I just showed you are national aggregates, but throughout the report, we try to break things down to a very granular local level to give people a sense of how these impacts are redistributed across the country. And so what we see, this is looking at all the different states and all the different impacts as they add up. What you can see are that there are large segments of the country, for example, the Southeast, where median cases are just for these limited number of sectors that we examine lead to GDP losses on the scale of 6 to 8%. Okay, so these are very large effects, and but there are, for example, places where there are benefits. For example, the Pacific Northwest is a region that seems to experience a very small amount of positive economic gain from warming in aggregate. Now, one of the exercises we did in this report was to try to think about how populations adapt over time, trying to cope with enhanced stress due to climate change. And I'm going to refer you to a talk that's being held tomorrow that goes into detail about how we did that in this report. But we see that there are some sectors where adaptation is very effective and other sectors where it seems to be much more challenging. Okay? So just the general sweeping statement that adaptation is going to sort of deliver us from these economic costs is not the right approach. There are several takeaways for the report. I'm going to skip them due to time, and I just want to tell you that moving forward, we are thinking about applying these methods globally to estimate the global social cost of carbon. So for anyone who's sort of interested in finding more about that program, please contact me, and we would be happy to get your thoughts on it. Thank you very much.